The disappearance of Bobby Dunbar. I first heard about Bobby Dunbar on a quiet afternoon, the kind where the air hangs heavy with an inexplicable tension. The story had always been an oddity, whispered among locals, but never given much thought beyond the realm of idle gossip. Little did I know that my life would soon become inexorably entwined with the chilling events of that long-forgotten tale. It was the summer of 1912, a year that would forever scar the Dunbar family and leave a mark on all who came into contact with them. The Dunbars were a well-to-do family from Opelousas, Louisiana, and on the fateful day of Bobby's disappearance, they had gone to Swayze Lake, a place where locals would often escape the sweltering southern heat. The lake was surrounded by thick woods, dark and almost menacing, even in the light of day. Bobby, a curious and adventurous 4-year-old, had wandered too far from the family's picnic site, and when they realized he was missing, panic quickly set in. The search for Bobby was exhaustive. The townsfolk combed through every inch of the woods and dredged the lake for days. But there was no sign of the boy. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Weeks turned into months, and the hope of finding Bobby alive slowly diminished. His mother, Leslie, was inconsolable, haunted by the loss of her child, her eyes hollowed out by the endless nights spent crying and praying for his return. Then 8 months later, a miracle, or so it seemed, occurred. Bobby Dunbar was found in Mississippi, living with a man named William Walters, a traveling tinker. Walters claimed the boy was not Bobby, but Bruce Anderson, the son of a woman named Julia Anderson, who had entrusted him with her child. But the Dunbars were adamant. This was their Bobby, and they took him home despite Walter's protests and Julia's tearful pleas that the boy was hers. What should have been a joyful reunion was marred by whispers, by the nagging doubt that gnawed at the edges of the Dunbars' relief. Though the boy looked like Bobby and had a birthmark on his foot similar to the one their Bobby had, there was something off about him. He was distant, his once bright eyes now dull, and his voice carried a strange lilt that sent shivers down Leslie's spine every time he called her Mama. The boy's nightmares were the worst. Each night, he would wake screaming, his voice shrill and full of terror. Yet he could never remember the dreams when morning came. As the months passed, the tension in the Dunbar household grew unbearable. Leslie tried to ignore the feeling of dread that settled over her like a heavy fog. But it was always there, just beneath the surface. The townspeople began to talk about the boy who returned and how he wasn't quite the same. Even Leslie's husband, Percy, seemed to be growing more and more distant, as if he too was beginning to doubt the boy's identity. One night, when the air was thick with the promise of an approaching storm, Leslie decided to confront her fears. She waited until the boy was asleep, his small form curled up beneath the blankets, his face bathed in the dim light of the kerosene lamp. She watched him for a moment, her heart heavy with a mixture of love and fear. Then with trembling hands, she reached out and gently pulled back the covers, exposing the boy's feet. She stared at the birthmark, the small crescent shape on his right foot that had once convinced her this was her Bobby. But as she looked closer, the mark seemed to shift, to shimmer in the flickering light. Leslie blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She leaned in closer, her face just inches from the boy's foot, and that's when she saw it. The mark was not a birthmark at all, but something else. Something that pulsed faintly beneath the skin, as if alive. A cold dread washed over her, and she stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The boy stirred, his eyes snapping open, and for a brief moment, Leslie saw something in those eyes. Something dark and ancient. Something that did not belong to a child. The boy's lips twisted into a smile that sent a chill down her spine, and in a voice that was not quite his own, he whispered, "Mama, what's wrong?" Leslie's scream tore through the night. But as the storm outside broke, drowning her cries in the roar of thunder, the boy simply lay there, his smile widening, as if he knew a secret that would shatter the world. And that was the night when Leslie Dunbar began to understand that the boy who had come home was not her Bobby. Not anymore, but something much worse. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion for Leslie. She became a ghost in her own home, barely able to function, her every thought consumed by the terrifying realization that the boy who had returned to her was not her son. She dared not speak of what she had seen, not even to Percy. How could she explain the unexplainable? The horror she had glimpsed in the dark of night seemed so unreal. Yet it gnawed at her, a relentless certainty that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Leslie began to watch the boy more closely, studying his every move, his every word. At times, he seemed like Bobby. He played with the same toys, had the same mannerisms, but there were moments when his behavior would change, like a mask slipping. He would stare at her with those unsettling eyes, and in those moments she felt as though she were looking into a void, something vast and unfathomable. The nightmares continued, Every night, the boy would wake screaming, his voice echoing through the house like a banshee's wail. Leslie would rush to his side, her heart in her throat, but she no longer tried to comfort him. She feared touching him, feared what she might feel beneath his skin, something cold, something that did not belong to the warm body of a little boy. And then there were the incidents. Small, almost insignificant things that, taken alone, might have been dismissed as childish accidents. But Leslie began to notice a pattern, a growing malevolence in the boy's actions. It started with the family dog, a loyal old hound who had always been gentle and affectionate. One morning, Leslie found the dog cowering in the corner of the yard, its once friendly eyes wide with terror, a deep gash on its side. The boy stood nearby holding a stick, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Leslie asked, her voice trembling. The boy looked at her with those cold, dark eyes and simply said, "He didn't want to play anymore." Leslie's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, to grab the boy and shake him, demand to know what he had done. But the words caught in her throat. She felt paralyzed by fear, as if the boy's gaze held her in place, rooting her to the spot. The dog survived, but it refused to go near the boy after that, slinking away whenever he approached. Things escalated from there. Leslie began to find dead birds around the house, their tiny bodies twisted and broken, left in places where she would be sure to find them, in the kitchen, on the porch, even in her bed. Each time, the boy would simply shrug and say, "They must have fallen," his voice devoid of emotion. One evening, Percy finally confronted her. He had noticed her growing distance, her refusal to be alone with the boy, and the way she flinched whenever the child came near. He asked her what was wrong, his tone gentle but firm, the way one might speak to someone on the verge of hysteria. "Leslie, you've got to stop this. You're scaring him, scaring us all. He's just a boy, our Bobby." But the way he said "our Bobby" made Leslie's skin crawl. She could hear the doubt in his voice, could see the unease in his eyes, even if he wouldn't admit it. Percy was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince her. "No, Percy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's not Bobby, he's something else. I don't know what he is, but he's not our son." Percy's face hardened, his frustration boiling over. "That's enough, Leslie. This has gone on long enough. You need to pull yourself together. He's been through so much already. Losing him once, and now this? You're going to drive yourself mad." She wanted to tell him everything. About the birthmark, the eyes, the things she had seen and felt, but the words wouldn't come. How could she make him believe? She wasn't even sure if she believed it herself, or if she was just losing her mind. That night, Leslie decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to know the truth, even if it destroyed her. She waited until the house was quiet, until she was sure that Percy and the boy were asleep. And then she crept down to the kitchen. Her hands shook as she lit a lantern and retrieved the knife from the drawer, its blade catching the dim light. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she knew she had to confront whatever this thing was that had taken her son's place. She made her way to the boy's room, her footsteps silent on the creaking floorboards. The door was ajar, and as she pushed it open, her breath caught in her throat. The boy was standing by the window, bathed in the pale moonlight, his back to her. He was humming softly, a strange, haunting melody that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. For a moment she hesitated, the knife trembling in her grip, but then the boy turned to face her. His eyes were black, voids that swallowed the light, and his mouth twisted into that terrible smile. "Mama," he said in that too familiar voice. "What are you doing?" Leslie stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What have you done with my son?" The boy's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth that had no place in a child's mouth. "Your son!" he echoed, his voice dripping with malice. "He's with us now, and soon you will be too." Leslie's scream echoed through the house, but as she turned to flee, the boy lunged at her with inhuman speed, knocking the lantern from her hand. The room plunged into darkness, and she felt the cold grip of his hands on her arm, pulling her back, dragging her down into the shadows. The last thing she heard before everything went black was that same haunting melody, echoing in the darkness, wrapping around her like a shroud. And then nothing. When Percy awoke the next morning, he found the boy sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast as if nothing had happened. There was no sign of Leslie, and when Percy asked the boy if he had seen her, the child looked up with those dark, empty eyes and simply said, "Mama went away." The knife was gone, and in its place on the boy's wrist was a new mark, shaped like a crescent, just like the one Bobby had been born with. But this one was still bleeding. The days after Leslie's disappearance passed in a blur for Percy. He tried to carry on as if everything were normal, telling himself that Leslie had just gone away for a while, that she would come back when she was ready. But deep down he knew something was horribly wrong. The house felt emptier, colder despite the boy's presence. No, asterisk because asterisk of it. The boy seemed unaffected by his mother's absence. He continued his daily routines, playing with his toys and eating meals with an unsettling calmness. There was no sign of grief or confusion, no questions about where Leslie had gone. Instead, he would often sit at the kitchen table, his dark eyes fixed on Percy, a faint smile playing on his lips, as if he knew something that Percy didn't. The neighbors started asking questions. They noticed Leslie's absence, and though Percy tried to assure them that she was visiting relatives, the whispers began to grow. They whispered about the strange things they had seen. The dead animals, the odd behavior of the boy, and the way Leslie had been acting in the weeks before she vanished. Some even said they had seen her in the dead of night, walking through the woods as if in a trance. Percy was at his breaking point. The whispers gnawed at him, the doubts and fears that had been buried deep within him now clawing their way to the surface. He avoided the boy as much as possible, staying out late, drinking more than he should, trying to drown out the memories of that night. The last night he had seen his wife. One evening, as Percy sat alone in the parlor, nursing a glass of whiskey, he heard a sound that sent a chill down his spine. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the boy's room. He had heard it before, late at night, when he was lying in bed, but he had always dismissed it as the house settling or the wind against the window. But this time the sound was unmistakable, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get his attention. Percy set down his glass and stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He knew he had to confront whatever was happening, to face the growing horror that had taken over his home. As he made his way down the hallway, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear, drowning out the pounding of his heart. He reached the boy's room, the door slightly ajar, and hesitated for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. He could feel the cold draft seeping through the crack, could hear the faint hum of that haunting melody, one that Leslie had mentioned before she disappeared. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was bathed in an eerie, pale light, the source of which Percy couldn't place. The boy was sitting on the bed, his back to the door, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady, coming from the far corner of the room. "Bobby?" Percy's voice wavered as he called out, his fear evident. "What are you doing?" The boy didn't answer, didn't even move. Percy took a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the sound. And then he saw it. A small, weathered box, sitting on the floor in the corner, its lid slightly open, the tapping coming from within. Percy's stomach churned as he approached the box, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch it. The wood was old, splintered in places, and there were strange symbols carved into its surface. Symbols that Percy didn't recognize, but that filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He lifted the lid, his breath catching in his throat as the tapping ceased abruptly. Inside the box was something wrapped in a tattered cloth, stained with dark, dried blood. With trembling fingers, Percy unwrapped the cloth, revealing what lay within. A small, withered hand, severed at the wrist, the fingers curled into a claw-like shape. The skin was gray and mottled, the nails long and jagged, and there was a faint, sickly sweet odor that made Percy gag. He stumbled back, dropping the box as the hand tumbled out onto the floor with a sickening thud. The boy finally turned to face him, his eyes blacker than the night, his expression one of eerie calm. "Mama says you shouldn't have touched that," he said in a voice that was not quite his own, a voice that seemed to echo with the cries of the damned. Percy felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he backed away, his mind reeling. "What is this? What are you?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. The boy slowly slid off the bed, his movements unnatural, almost serpentine, as if his joints were bending in ways they shouldn't. "You took me in," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But I'm not Bobby. Bobby is with us now, and soon you will be too." Percy's heart pounded in his chest as the boy advanced toward him, his small frame somehow towering, filling the room with an oppressive darkness. Percy's back hit the wall, and he realized with a sickening jolt that he had nowhere to run. The boy's smile widened, revealing those sharp, gleaming teeth that had haunted Leslie's nightmares. "You can't escape," the boy hissed, his voice a twisted mix of childlike innocence and ancient malevolence. "It's already too late." Suddenly the window shattered, the wind howling through the room as the lights flickered and died. The room was plunged into darkness, and in the blackness Percy could hear the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, approaching from all sides. The tapping resumed, louder now, more insistent, echoing off the walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell silent, save for the ragged sound of Percy's breathing. He fumbled for the door, his hands slick with sweat. But before he could reach it, something cold and sharp wrapped around his wrist, pulling him back. He screamed as he was dragged to the floor, the boy's face inches from his. those terrible black eyes boring into his soul. "Mama says it's time to go," the boy whispered. And then there was pain. Searing, blinding pain as those sharp teeth sank into Percy's neck, tearing through flesh and bone. The last thing Percy heard before darkness claimed him was the sound of the boy's laughter. A sound that would echo in the house long after he was gone, mingling with the wind and the whispers of the damned. And then there was only silence. When the townsfolk finally noticed that something was wrong, it was already too late. The Dunbar house had been silent for days, the windows dark, the door locked tight. Neighbors whispered among themselves, their unease growing as the days turned into weeks with no sign of Percy or Leslie. The boy, if he was still there, had not been seen either. Finally, a group of men decided to investigate. They approached the house with a mix of fear and determination, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path as they neared the front door. One of the men, a burly farmer named Henry, knocked loudly, the sound echoing in the still air. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, but the door remained closed, the house as silent as a grave. "Something's wrong," Henry muttered, exchanging a worried glance with the others. "We need to get inside." It didn't take much effort to break the door down. The wood was old, the lock weak, and it splintered easily under the force of their combined strength. As the door swung open, a foul stench wafted out, hitting them like a physical blow. The men recoiled, covering their noses and mouths as they stepped inside. The house was in disarray. Furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they ventured further into the darkened rooms. The men moved slowly, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that danced eerily on the walls. "Where is everyone?" one of the men whispered, his voice trembling. Henry didn't answer. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, a gnawing dread that told him they were too late, that whatever had happened here was far beyond their understanding. They found Percy in the parlor, slumped in an armchair, his face frozen in a grotesque rictus of terror. His throat had been savagely torn open, the wound gaping and blackened, as if it had been left to fester for days. The men gasped, some turning away in horror, while others whispered prayers under their breath. But it was the sight of the boy that truly shook them to their core. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his small frame hunched over a plate of untouched food. His back was to them, his head bowed as if in deep concentration. Henry approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest, the lantern in his hand trembling. "Bobby!" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy didn't respond. Henry took another step forward, the light from his lantern illuminating the scene in a sickly yellow glow. And then he saw it, the blood, dried and caked under the boy's fingernails, staining his clothes, the same dark crimson that streaked the walls and floor. The boy's head snapped up suddenly, and he turned to face them. His eyes, those terrible black voids, seemed to bore into Henry's soul, freezing him in place. The boy's mouth twisted into that unnerving smile, and for a moment, the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with an oppressive, malevolent presence. "He's not Bobby," Henry croaked, his voice shaking. "Dear God, he's not Bobby." The boy tilted his head, as if considering Henry's words, and then he spoke in that voice that was not his own, a voice filled with a chilling mix of childlike innocence and ancient malice. "You're right," he said softly, his smile widening. "I'm not Bobby." Before anyone could react, the boy stood, his movements unnaturally fluid, almost serpentine. The room seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer, creeping toward them as the boy began to hum that haunting melody, the same one that had driven Leslie to the brink of madness. And then, in an instant, the boy lunged at Henry, faster than any human should be able to move. Henry barely had time to raise his arms in defense before the boy was on him, teeth sinking into his flesh, tearing at him with a ferocity that defied belief. The other men screamed, stumbling back in terror as they watched in horror. They could see it now, the truth that had been hidden beneath the boy's innocent facade. A monstrous, inhuman creature, its true form revealed in the flickering light of the lanterns. The thing that had once been a boy was now something else entirely, something that should not exist in this world. The men fled, tripping over each other in their desperation to escape the house. Behind them, they could hear the boy's laughter, echoing through the halls, a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They didn't stop running until they were well away from the house, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their hearts pounding in their chests. None of them spoke, too shaken by what they had seen, too terrified to put it into words. They knew that whatever that thing was, it was no longer Bobby Dunbar. The boy who had returned was something far worse, an abomination sent by forces they could not comprehend. In the days that followed, the house was abandoned, left to rot as the townsfolk avoided it at all costs. The whispers grew louder, the story of the Dunbars becoming a cautionary tale, a warning to all who dared to venture too close to the dark woods surrounding Swazi Lake. But the boy, the thing that had taken Bobby's place, was never seen again. Some said it had returned to the place it had come from, satisfied with the destruction it had wrought. Others believed it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to take it in. And then years later, the story of Bobby Dunbar took one final chilling turn. A group of children, playing near the edge of the woods, stumbled upon a small, weathered box, half buried in the dirt. The box was old, the wood splintered and covered in strange symbols, just like the one found in the boys' room all those years ago. Inside, they found a hand, withered and gray, the fingers curled into a claw-like shape. But this time, there was something else. Something that had not been there before. A small, tattered photograph, yellowed with age, showing a young boy with bright, smiling eyes. On the back, scrawled in a shaky hand, were the words, "Help me, I'm still here." The children ran home in terror, and the box was soon forgotten, lost to the passage of time. But the story of Bobby Dunbar, of the boy who disappeared, and the thing that took his place, lives on, a dark legend whispered in hushed tones, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because sometimes, when you find what you're looking for, you lose far more than you ever imagined.